Addressing Gettysburg.
Good? Yep. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you all. Thank you for being here, as always. My name is Christopher Gwinn. I'm the Chief of Interpretation and Education here at Gettysburg National Military Park. And this is the last installment of our Winter Lecture Series for 2024. So again, I'm so grateful that you're all here. A couple of reminders, as I always give. If you do have a cell phone, please turn that to silent. If you need to get up to use the restroom or the facilities, or you're tired of hearing me talk, by all means do it. I know we're crammed in here. We're not in the theaters. I apologize for that, but again, I'm always very grateful that you're here. A couple things. One, today is my wife's birthday. So, Allison.
And you scheduled yourself to be here.
I was going to say, yeah, it's bad that I'm not with her. It's even worse that I was the one that scheduled myself to be here today. So mea culpa, happy birthday, Allison. Secondly, as you all know, all of the Winter Lecture Series this year has been filmed by our good friends Addressing Gettysburg and Matt Callery, who's operating the camera for me. Now, Matt's not doing this out of the kindness of his heart. We have paid him what I will call a modest honorarium. Very modest. So he's technically a contractor. And I've worked with a lot of contractors. Some are very good. Some are not good. Matt has been very, very good. So occasionally at the park, when someone goes above and beyond, when we have a staff member, a ranger, a volunteer, a member of the foundation do something that really benefits the park, we give them something that's kind of akin to a brevet promotion. Doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't come with any money, but we might ask you to do something else for us. And that's what I have here. So it's a small commemorative coin that we give out. So Matt. That's awesome. I love that stuff. All right. For the next 45 minutes or so, let's talk about Camp Letterman. It's one of the largest field hospitals established following the Battle of Gettysburg. And before I delve into that, I think anybody who does history has to acknowledge the fact that we build off of the work that people before us have done. And the individuals you see up on the slide, Phil Leachek, Fran Fayok, Rick Schrader, these are all licensed battlefield guides. I've stolen from them liberally and shamelessly. And so I'm very grateful to them. In addition to that, I'd add Ranger John Tracy, who's now down at Cedar Creek Battlefield. He's done tremendous work looking at an individual who we're going to talk a lot about today, a man by the name of Dr. Henry Janes, and I stole from him as well. Pete Mealy, who operates as the executive director of the Seminary Ridge Museum, has done fantastic work on Camp Letterman in the aftermath of the battle. And to that, I'd add Jake Gwinn, who was down in Frederick operating the National Civil War Medical Museum. They've done tremendous work. And finally, here at the park, John Heiser, who was our previous park historian, and a ranger by the name of Gregory A. Coco, who passed away a number of years ago. But Greg Coco wrote what I would argue, at least as of this date, the definitive history on the aftermath of the battle. He was a Vietnam veteran, and I think that colored his perception of the Battle of Gettysburg. And he's one of the first individuals to really delve into those dark chapters of the battle and the campaign, the aftermath, the treatment of the wounded, the prisoners, the burial of the dead. And in one of his books, he talks about Camp Letterman. And he has a quote that I found very powerful. He said, "Camp Letterman was a world of its own, with every known human emotion brought together in its 4 long months of operation." So Camp Letterman, as I mentioned, is the general hospital that's established following the Battle of Gettysburg. It takes about 80 acres of land off of the York Pike on what is the George Wolfe Farm. It's in operation for about 121 days, and during those 121 days, an estimated 4,217 wounded Union and Confederate soldiers make their way through that camp. And it's not just a hospital. It's a military camp. There's a military presence there. You have about 1/3 to 1/2 at any one point in time of the patients in that hospital being Confederates. So it's also a prisoner of war camp. There are male attendants, obviously male soldiers, but there's also female nurses. So it's this really interesting combination of different people with different backgrounds, different allegiances and genders, all coming together for 4 months on the Gettysburg battlefield. And what I'd like to do is explore that. Talk a little bit about Camp Letterman. What was it like to be a doctor at the hospital? What was it like to be one of the wounded soldiers treated there? What happened to the site following the Battle of Gettysburg? What's its state of preservation now? And my hope is you walk away at the end of these 45 minutes with a better appreciation for Camp Letterman, its place in the story of the Battle of Gettysburg, and perhaps a renewed appreciation for some of the medical professionals who worked at that camp. Again, particularly one man named Henry Janes, who we'll talk about. Now, any conversation, any program about Camp Letterman needs to start in the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg. So the battle's 3 days long. You have about 165,000 men fighting across this landscape in some of the most bloody and horrific combat of the American Civil War. Just by the sheer presence of the two armies in this community, Gettysburg becomes one of the 10 most populous places in the United States. It's bigger than every single city in the South with the exception of New Orleans. Of course, Gettysburg is simply unable to sustain that kind of population on its landscape. Again, they fight for 3 days, causing an estimated 51,000 casualties. It's 51,000 men who were killed, wounded, missing, captured, the bloodiest battle ever fought on the Western Hemisphere. Now, of those, about 7,000 men are killed outright. They're shot dead on the battlefield. They're buried in shallow graves. Union troops are usually buried in a single grave by their comrades. Confederates, of course, usually in mass graves like we can see up on the right of the screen there. Following the battle, left in the community and the surrounding countryside are as many as 20,000 wounded United States soldiers and Confederate soldiers. Every church, barn, farmhouse, building for literally miles around the town of Gettysburg is converted into a hospital. Surgeons, nurses, volunteers are at work around the clock in sometimes the worst of conditions. Cornelia Hancock, a young nurse from Hancock Bridge in New Jersey, would be one of the first nurses to arrive on the battlefield. She gets here on July 6, 1863, and she heads to the 2nd Corps Field Hospital on the 7th of July, the following day. And she would write in a letter home that, quote, "There are no words in the English language to express the sufferings I have witnessed today." The reality is, things would have been a whole lot worse if it were not for this gentleman, Major Jonathan Letterman. And he's often referred to as the father of battlefield medicine, or the father of modern battlefield medicine. He's the medical director of the Army of the Potomac. He's placed in that position by George McClellan when the Union Army is on the peninsula. And that's at a real, I don't know how much you all know about the Peninsula Campaign, but the health and well-being and fitness of the Army of the Potomac at the latter stages of the Peninsula Campaign is deplorable. You have men suffering from things like scurvy. So Letterman takes over, he immediately begins to turn things around, and he realizes very quickly that the medical situation in the Army of the Potomac is really bad. The system for evacuating the wounded is essentially non-existent. Medicine is being done at the regimental level. Patient outcomes are suffering as a result of this. And what he does over the course of the next few months, both before and after the Battle of Antietam, is he will literally revolutionize how medicine is done on the battlefield. And we could have a whole lecture about Jonathan Letterman, and it's been done. It's online, it's much better than what I could do, so I encourage you to go listen. But he establishes a professional ambulance corps. He does all kinds of things. And that system, elements of it were in place at the Battle of Antietam. It was tested at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, but those are not ideal conditions for the Army of the Potomac. They're defeats. They're separated from their wounded in some instances by rivers. Gettysburg is going to be the first opportunity for what I would call the Letterman plan to be in full effect. And it is, quite frankly, remarkable. Wounded are evacuated from the battlefield in a timely and efficient manner. Initial surgeries are done relatively quickly following the battle. So this scene that Cornelia Hancock witnesses when she goes to the 2nd Corps Field Hospital, as terrible as it was, with the shortage of supplies that then existed, again, could have been a whole lot worse had it not been for Jonathan Letterman. Again, he revolutionizes battlefield medicine. But by the aftermath of the battle, when I say aftermath, we're talking July 4th, July 5th, we all know something that Jonathan Letterman and George Meade do not. We know the battle is over, and there's not going to be another major fight for the next few months. And we know that. They don't. So the Army is going to move. The Army is going to pursue Robert E. Lee. And there may be another battle. Perhaps Meade is going to attack Confederates as their backs are against the Potomac River at Williamsport. Again, we all know that's not going to happen. They don't. So Jonathan Letterman is going to have to depart with the rest of the Army of the Potomac. But again, he's got 20,000 wounded men left behind, and they need to be taken care of. And so an order goes out from Army headquarters, quote, the medical director will establish a general hospital at Gettysburg for the wounded that cannot be moved with the Army. That's issued on July 5th. And so now Jonathan Letterman has to pick a guy to make that happen. Because you can have the best plan in the world. You can have the best plan in the world, but it is just ink on paper unless you have individuals who are able to execute it. And Jonathan Letterman is going to turn to this gentleman. His name is Henry James. And again, if you walk away with anything from this talk, I hope it's a better appreciation for this individual. He is in his early 30s, 31 years old. He is from Waterbury, Vermont. He is an incredibly impressive individual. He earns his medical degree from the New York College of Physicians and Surgeons in 1855. In 1861, he enters the United States Army as surgeon of the 3rd Vermont Volunteer Infantry. He'll be with them throughout the early campaigns of the American Civil War. Following the Battle of South Mountain, he establishes and runs a field hospital in Burkittsville, Maryland. And in the fall of 1862, he'll take over hospitals in Frederick, Maryland. And again, these are mostly hospitals dealing with the wounded following the Battle of Antietam. He is an effective administrator. He is a very capable surgeon. And Jonathan Letterman is going to turn to him to manage this situation following the Battle of Gettysburg. So he's presented with what we call a dumpster fire. That's what James has, right? Again, the Army of the Potomac is going to move. There's 605 surgeons, assistant surgeons, or acting assistant surgeons in the Army of the Potomac. 605. He is going to leave behind, and I want to get this number right, and I have it down. It's a little over 100 surgeons with Henry James. So 605 are going to leave. 106 medical officers will be left behind to care for 20,000 wounded men. So to put that in perspective, that's roughly one, what I would call medical professional for every 188 wounded men. 1 to 188. So I want you to think of that the next time you go to the urgent care and you sit in that little waiting room and they got this screen with all the people ahead of you. Imagine you're waiting 188 people. And these aren't individuals looking for immunizations or kids with ear infections. These are men with gunshot wounds. These are men with lacerations from artillery shell fragments. These 20,000 wounded men, about 6,000 of whom are Confederates, are spread across, according to James, 60 separate field hospital locations across the battlefield. Now I want you to think about the practical challenges of that. You have 20,000 wounded men spread across 60, it's probably actually more, 60 plus field hospitals. Think of how difficult it is, one, to track people. Where are they? How are they doing? Think about how difficult it is to supply these individual field hospitals. And think about what I would call the lack of consistency. You might have a field hospital that's overwhelmed with wounded individuals in one location. You might have one a few miles away that it's not. One might be really well supplied. One might be very limited with supplies. And so it's a really difficult situation that James encounters. So, that's the reason that they want to establish what I would call a centralized general hospital on the battlefield. You want to take all of these wounded individuals, all of these medical staff, medical professionals, bring them together in one location. That way you can track patients better. You can provide care for patients much more efficiently. You can use your available medical staff a whole lot better. And then the goal of this general hospital, and we should make sure we all realize this, the goal of this hospital is not to take a wounded soldier and cure him, make him 100% all better. That's not the goal of the hospital. The goal of the hospital that they establish is to take a wounded soldier and get him well enough, get him stable enough to evacuate him, to transport him to some other general hospital that has more established facilities. And these might be in Harrisburg or Baltimore or Philadelphia or Washington, D.C. So really the idea of this general hospital, consolidate patients, get them well enough to move. Now ultimately on July 7th or 9th, they find a location that meets all of their needs. So what you're looking at is called the Elliott map. It's produced following the Battle of Gettysburg, and it shows the locations of graves on the battlefield. But for our purposes, it's pretty good for identifying where this general hospital site is going to be located. So we are the red dot. That's the Museum and Visitor Center. That large blue circle up on the far right corner is the location they select for this general hospital, which they will call Camp Letterman in honor of Medical Director Jonathan Letterman. It's going to be located off the York Pike, northeast of the town of Gettysburg. Now the reason they chose that site should be fairly obvious to us. It has a lot of benefits. So one, it's located right off the York Pike, which is a major thoroughfare moving through Gettysburg. It's located very close to the rail line, the railroad. And it's going to be that rail line that they'll use to evacuate wounded once they're stable. It's on the George Wolfe Farm, and it's on what they end up calling Hospital Hill. So it's high ground. It has good drainage. There's a spring on site. You need water. If you're going to have a hospital, you need water. And so it has a tremendous number of benefits. And it was used by the military before, that location. In the winter of 1861, 1862, elements of the 10th New York Cavalry, I believe, established a camp there. On June 26th, right before the Battle of Gettysburg, that's where John Gordon's brigade of Confederates will encamp after they've moved through the town. So it's a really good location. Now they need to do a lot of work to get it into shape to be a hospital. They need to clear some elements of the land. They need to dig drainage ditches to make sure the land stays dry. They need to erect the tents that'll ultimately be on the site. But that's the location they're going to choose. I pulled this map from our vertical files downstairs, and this is a map. It's imperfect. It is not exact, but it gives us a good sense of how the camp ultimately will be laid out. And so what you'll have are rows of tents, as many as 400 at the height of the camp, along 6 avenues. These 6 avenues will be divided up into divisions. Each division will be essentially commanded by a surgeon, a medical officer. Those divisions are then broken up into wards. Approximately, according to Cornelia Hancock, 4 tents to a ward. So if you're Cornelia Hancock, you might be assigned to 1st Division, Ward E. And those are your 4 tents that you're going to be responsible for. In each tent are 12 to 16 wounded soldiers. So that's how the camp is going to be laid out, along these avenues. Now, in addition to that, you're going to have, and we can see up on the far left, top left, picture of the patient's tents. You're going to have all of the other facilities on site that you need if you're running a major hospital. You're going to have a kitchen, that's top right, capable of feeding as many as 1,300 patients in a day. And not just one meal either, because what you're given at Camp Letterman is going to be based on your particular condition. So you could have a light diet, you could have a heavy diet. It's patient specific. You're going to have surgical tents. You're going to have tents for the staff. You're going to have a graveyard. They establish a graveyard at Camp Letterman for those that die while they're being cared for there. And there's also going to be an embalming tent where if you can afford it, your loved one could be embalmed and then shipped home to a hometown cemetery. In addition to that, on site at Camp Letterman, you'll have the United States Sanitary Commission and the United States Christian Commission. These are aid societies, benevolent aid societies that provide support to the medical efforts of the United States Army during the American Civil War. So this is a massive, massive camp that is implanting itself on the Gettysburg battlefield. On July 20th, July 21st, around that time frame, the camp will open. The camp will be ready to receive patients. And that's all well and good. But if you have a hospital, you need patients, obviously. And right now, as of the date that camp opens, those patients are spread across those 60-plus field hospitals. And one of the biggest challenges for the camp initially will be taking those severely wounded men and transporting them the mile, 2 miles, 3 miles to Camp Letterman. And in some cases, again, there's no easy patients at Camp Letterman. These are the guys that can't be moved. If you had a relatively superficial wound, well, the Letterman system is going to pump you right back out to your regiment once you're well enough. If you are wounded but you can walk, if you are wounded but you're stable enough to be transported, that's ultimately what's going to happen to you. Only those patients that are so severely wounded they can't be transported end up at Letterman. So again, these are individuals with fractured thighs, injuries to their spine, gunshot wounds that are, again, of a much more serious nature than those that are able to be transported previous. So you got to get these men to Camp Letterman. And oftentimes the only way to do it was to physically have stretcher bearers carry them from their field hospital to the campsite. There was one stretcher bearer who said that he was 1.5 miles away from the camp. The most he could do are 2 round trips a day to get these wounded men to the campsite. Sophronia Buckland, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing her first name right. Sophronia Buckland would write of the opening of the camp. She was a nurse there. Quote, "A line of stretchers, 1.5 miles in length, each bearing a hero who had fought nigh to death, told us where our work lay, and we commenced it at once." Now, it's not going to be a mass exodus of wounded to the camp. It's going to happen in drips and drabs through the next days, weeks, and even months. But by July 20th, the camp is open. So let's take a look at the medical team, at least a few of them, that'll be operating at the camp. Now, Janes, he's in charge of everything following the battle, all of the hospitals. The individual responsible specifically for overseeing Camp Letterman is going to be the individual you see up on the screen. His name is Cyrus N. Chamberlain. He is a lot of Chamberlains at the Battle of Gettysburg, as we will see, a lot of Chamberlains. He's the surgeon of the 10th Massachusetts. And I found a quote from an infantryman in the 10th Massachusetts, and he writes about Chamberlain following the Battle of Williamsburg, which happens in May of 1862. And it's one of the first big battles that the 10th Massachusetts are involved in. And this soldier saw Dr. Chamberlain covered in blood, amputating arms and legs. And he wrote that Dr. Chamberlain looks more like a butcher than ever, but he is a very careful surgeon. And I thought that that was about the highest praise that a soldier could give to a medical officer. He was a very careful surgeon. He's in charge. Under him at any one time are going to be 4 surgeons, 7 assistant surgeons, 28 acting assistant surgeons, 9 Confederate doctors, and 18 what he labels as rebel nurses. Now, there's another Dr. Chamberlain at Camp Letterman, and he runs the embalming tent. I cannot tell you the amount of confusion that I had trying to figure out which Chamberlain is which. Because if you're a parent of a wounded soldier and you get a letter saying your loved one's with Dr. Chamberlain, depending on what Chamberlain they're talking about, the outcome could be drastically different. So under Chamberlain are all of these individuals. Not enumerated there are the many, many nurses and attendants that were also operating at the camp. And so let's meet a few of them. Sophronia Buckland. I mentioned her a little bit earlier. She's 35 years old. She's a native of Auburn, New York. And she writes a great account of her time as a nurse during the American Civil War. And she begins by recalling this incident when she's still in New York. She's at an orphanage or some sort of asylum. And she looks out the window and she sees soldiers from her county drilling in preparation for going off to the front, off to the seat of war. And she writes about how she wished that she could do something to support them. And so she decides that she's going to go become a nurse. She's a Dix nurse, and by that I mean she's overseen by Dorothea Dix. Are we familiar with her?
Yes.
Dorothea Dix, sometimes called Dragon Dix, is the superintendent of female nurses during the American Civil War. She has what I will call a tough reputation. She was very selective in terms of who she would accept into this corps of nurses. And the picture is not altogether flattering, but I think it's important to establish this. So she wanted individuals who were matronly. So you had to be over a certain age, I think it was 35. You had to be under 50. Ideally, you'd be married. You had to be, I won't say the word unattractive, but her thought process was she didn't want to subject these genteel, impressionable young ladies to the suffering and toil that they would witness in these hospitals, and also the men that would be there. Apparently, Sophronia Buckland met that. She fit within that umbrella. She is, of all of the people that I looked at, with the exception of Chamberlain and Janes, she's at the hospital the longest. She's there the day the hospital opens. She's there the day the hospital closes. And if you are ever inclined to read more about this, she leaves one of the best accounts of daily life at Camp Letterman out of anyone I've read. For example, in her book, she talks about the daily rhythms of life that a Letterman nurse would go through. So she talks about how the first thing every morning that would happen is stimulants would be given out to all of the patients, followed by beef tea, and then the meals would be served, special diets, she called it, again, based on the needs of that particular patient. This happens 3 times a day for a total of 9 visits to every single patient under that nurse's charge per day. In addition to that, every patient would have their faces washed, their hair combed, sponge baths were given as necessary, but only by the male attendants, and of course wound dressers would make their rounds to every single patient each morning. Cornelia Hancock, and I've mentioned her, she's slightly different. So as I mentioned, she's 23 years old. She's from Hancock Bridge, New Jersey. By her own account, she comes from an eccentric and independent family. She leaves for Gettysburg on the 5th of July. She arrives on the evening of July 6th. Again, drawn to the scene of conflicts in the hopes of helping those who were wounded in the battle. She was rejected by Dorothea Dix because of her, quote, her youth and rosy appearance. So good for her. She goes anyways, and she ends up serving, as I mentioned, in the 2nd Corps Field Hospital before she's transferred over to Letterman. And Hancock was, based off of the accounts I've read, she was a favorite among the patients that she served. And you know, it's always very difficult to put yourself in the shoes, or in this case, the cot of a wounded soldier following the battle. So you're horrifically wounded. You're far away from loved ones. And you have a Sophronia Buckland, or you have a Cornelia Hancock coming to you, caring for you, taking on what I would have to imagine is almost a surrogate mother for you in this hospital. And that's the role that Cornelia Hancock and others will play. Additionally, you have Anna M. Holstein. She would be the matron in charge of all of the female nurses at Letterman. She's 39 years old, born in Muncie, Pennsylvania. She would serve with the 2nd Corps Hospital in the fall and winter of 1862, 1863. And again, she's placed in that position by Dr. Chamberlain. And then you'd have individuals like Justice Silliman. Now, Silliman is he's not a medical professional by training. He's a soldier. He was in the 17th Connecticut. He's slightly wounded on the 1st of July during the fighting north of town. He ends up being treated at the Spangler Farm, the George Spangler Farm, and he becomes a male attendant at the camp. And he has also a great account of daily life following the Battle of Gettysburg at Camp Letterman. And on top of all of these individuals, overseeing this whole operation is Mr. Henry Janes, or Dr. Henry Janes. Again, I want to take a moment to reflect on everything that this individual, this 31-year-old from Waterbury, Vermont, is responsible for. He signed up to be a doctor, to be a surgeon. And I would have to imagine at a fundamental level, he did that to care for people, to save lives. Well, guess what? Now he's a hospital administrator. He's not a doctor anymore. And we have in our museum galleries his trunk. It's the image on the right there. And I think that's fitting, because we don't have his surgical kit, we have his trunk. And I want to imagine for a moment that inside that trunk, and I don't know what he used it for, but let's imagine for a moment inside that trunk are all of the challenges, problems that Henry Janes has to face. And let's unpack it for a moment. So again, remember, he's in charge of not one hospital, but many hospitals. He's overseeing a military camp, so also order and discipline need to be enforced. He is in charge of a prisoner of war camp with what I will call high-value assets, which we'll talk about in a bit. He has to interface with a major transportation hub, and by that I mean the railroad. He's overseeing a military cemetery. Who's got that to deal with? And finally, more than all of that, Henry Janes is a manager of people. And people are complicated and people are messy. My father spent the better part of his career as a director of pharmacy at a hospital north of Boston. And I won't tell you what the hospital is, because I don't want you to Google this. But he would come home, and he was in a position to manage people. And he would talk about daily life at the hospital. And the stories tended to take on a certain hue. There are certain doctors that didn't like the pharmacists, certain pharmacists who didn't like the doctors, certain doctors who didn't like the nurses, certain nurses who couldn't get along with the doctors. And Janes, 160 years ago, is facing all of these same challenges. Let's take a look at some of them. So, incompetent surgeons. One of the things that happens following the battle is that an influx of individuals who I think are trying to help, at their core, they're trying to do the right thing, they arrive on the scene. And in the case of Dr. Letterman and Henry Janes, these are country doctors or physicians who come to the camps, come to the field hospitals with the intent of helping the wounded. But if you're a country doctor, you probably haven't seen a whole lot of gunshot wounds. They get to these field hospitals and they're either overwhelmed or they end up caring more about their own personal issues and suffering and discomfort than that of the soldiers. In his official report, October 3rd of 1863, Jonathan Letterman wrote about this. And he would say that no reliance can be placed on surgeons from civil life during or after a battle. They cannot or will not submit to the privations and discomforts which are necessary. And the great majority think more of their own personal comfort than they do of the wounded. This is him basically saying, stay out of my hair, you're not helping me. You're not helping me. Now, in some cases, these surgeons that are troublesome are already with the Army. Take the case of a doctor by the name of J.B. Carpenter. He's from New York, and he was a contract surgeon with the Army of the Potomac. And Janes is informed of the fact that this guy is stealing money from Confederate patients. He took $40 in gold from a soldier in Company D of the 5th Texas, $10 in gold and $35 in Confederate script from Lieutenant Parker out of the 17th Mississippi. So Janes had to let him go. He had another individual by the name of Perrin Gardner. This is a surgeon in the 1st West Virginia Cavalry. There's a battle in Hanover that happens just prior to the Battle of Gettysburg. Mostly it's a cavalry battle for the United States Army. And a field hospital is established in Hanover. And this gentleman, Dr. Perrin Gardner, is placed in charge of it by Judson Kilpatrick, the division commander of that particular cavalry division. And Gardner was just kind of a bad egg. That's the best way to describe him. He was running some sort of side hustle where he was making money off of soldiers being embalmed. There's one lieutenant that reports to Janes this man made $1,000 off of this embalming hustle. He managed to get most of his supplies through the people of Hanover. And that in turn angered the people of Hanover. At one point he threatens to burn down a liquor establishment that was doling out booze apparently to the soldiers. Janes tries to get rid of him. And this response, the response that Janes gets is that, well, I'm not under your command. Judson Kilpatrick is the only one that can remove me from command. And so in the end, Janes just closes the whole hospital. And that's how he gets rid of Perrin Gardner. In addition to that, as I mentioned before, Janes is overseeing a prisoner of war camp. He has, in some cases, over 1,000 Confederate prisoners that he's responsible for. Now, I want to be very clear about this. All of the Confederate prisoners that are being treated at Camp Letterman, they get the same treatment as the wounded soldiers for the Union Army. So it didn't matter what side you were on, it didn't matter what color your uniform was. If you're a wounded soldier at Camp Letterman, the treatment you get is the same as what's being done for the other side. And if you die at Camp Letterman and you're buried in the graveyard's not segregated. So you might be a soldier from New York, buried in this spot, and right next to that man might be a soldier from Texas or Virginia. So again, the cemetery is not segregated in that respect. Still though, at this camp, you have individuals who only a few days or weeks before were doing their best to kill one another, now within the same confines. Now usually they were in different tents. So the Confederate patients will be in one tent, the Union patients will be in another. On certain occasions, these tents were integrated, and that by and large did not go well. There's one Confederate soldier who's brought into a tent with some wounded soldiers from the Union Army in it, and the wounded Union soldier took offense to the fact that this wounded Confederate was being brought into his tent. And he said something to the effect of, he enlisted to kill rebels, and he doesn't have his musket, but his crutches will do just fine. And they end up removing the Confederate. On another occasion, there's a wounded officer, Union officer, I want to say he's from New York, and he was told he was going to be sharing a tent with a wounded Confederate, and he absolutely refused to do it. And so they kept him outside underneath a tree until the Confederate was removed. Occasionally, you'd have fisticuffs breaking out. There's a couple of occasions where Union troops and Union attendants are upset that the Confederates are getting the best food at some of the picnics they're holding. But by and large, these wounded men, they coexist side by side for about 4 months in the Gettysburg battlefield. But still, Janes has to manage that. A bigger issue, for Janes anyways, are the two individuals that I have up on the slide there, Isaac Tremble and James Kemper. These are both high-ranking Confederate officers who were left behind following the retreat of the Army of Northern Virginia, and now they're under Jane's custody. And in addition to all the other things he's dealing with, Janes is constantly being bugged by the Department of Susquehanna, led by General Couch, if you're familiar with him, about when these guys are going to be well enough that they can leave Gettysburg. And it reminded me a little bit, the correspondence reminded me a little bit of having to deal with an insurance company today. Right? You've used up your 3 days in the hospital, so now you gotta move along. Janes has to deal with that. Perhaps even more serious, Janes gets a disgruntled note regarding wounded Confederates who are well enough to walk going into the town of Gettysburg and cavorting around with the locals. He, where do I have it here? The specific letter he gets is, quote, I'm directed to call to your attention to the fact that rebel prisoners, both officers and men, are allowed to visit Gettysburg upon passes issued by you. It's reported that the rebels have been seen in town as late as 11 o'clock in company with females. James has to deal with that, too. This is going to be a shock to you, I have no doubt. But our forebears 160 years ago occasionally used prescription medicine for recreational purposes. And nothing is different in 1863. There was an issue at the camp where medical attendants apparently had been self-prescribing the stimulants to themselves. And when I say stimulants, I'm talking about whiskey, I'm talking about booze. And they had to crack down on that. And you'll note the solution. Only female attendants and nurses will be allowed to dole out the stimulants to the patients. So you're a doctor, you can write that prescription. But only the female nurse can be the ones that take it from the commissary or the storehouse and deliver it to the patients. Because, of course, female nurses would never abuse alcohol. Now, in addition to that, James gets his hand slapped by one of his many bosses because of the habit of some of the medical staff at Letterman using ambulances as their personal conveyances across the battlefield. Now, I mention all of this just to showcase all of the things that Henry Janes has to deal with, and we haven't even gotten to the wounded. We haven't even gotten there yet. He is administrating a major hospital with all of the issues, with all of the problems that a major hospital still today has to deal with. Except I'd argue his patients are in a far more serious condition, and he doesn't have all of the benefits that modern medical facilities have. As one final issue that he has to dance around, the camp gets a lot of visitors. And have you ever been working on something and you're really intent on your job and people just keep bugging you? That's kind of the position they're in. And you can probably pick out at least a few of the individuals up on the slide there. The individual on the far left, any idea who he is? The officer, his name's William Hammond. William Hammond was the former Surgeon General, and he was a good friend and colleague of Jonathan Letterman. He was a very progressive medical officer, a very progressive doctor. He, in May of 1863, prohibited the use of calomel from Army supplies. And it's mercury. They were doling out mercury. And Hammond didn't think it did any good. As a matter of fact, he thought it did harm. And he tried to get Army doctors to stop using it. But they were so used to operating in a certain way that they basically led an uprising against Hammond. He's removed from his position as Surgeon General to the detriment of the medical situation for the armies. But anyways, he visits. How about the individual just to the right of him? Any idea who he is? Stonewall Jackson's father-in-law. His name is George Junkin. He will come and visit the Confederate prisoners or the Confederate wounded at the camp. To the right, Dorothea Dix. She would make frequent visits to Camp Letterman, and you can just imagine the trepidation of the female nurses as Dorothea Dix is going around sticking her head in tents. And then finally on the right, of course, John Burns, civilian hero of Gettysburg, came to Camp Letterman to see Confederates in the flesh. Let's move on to the treatment of patients. Camp Letterman, for all intents and purposes, was a well-run, despite all the problems I just showed you, was a well-run, efficient medical facility where voluminous records are kept regarding the treatment of every single patient under the umbrella of that hospital. So what we have on the left here is basically a report that would be created, a medical record for each of the wounded men at Letterman, where their case is detailed. What surgeon is treating them? What procedures have been done on that particular patient? How they're doing. And on the right here, you can see again some of the tents of the camp. One of the great things that Janes does is while he's at Letterman, he establishes a board of consulting physicians. And that's going to be these three individuals you see up on the screen: Janes, Chamberlain, and a doctor by the name of Lewis Oakley. And every morning, they're going to get together. And they're going to go to all of the different divisions and all of the different wards. And they're going to look at the critical patients in each of those wards. And they're going to talk about what treatment that individual should have. So you're getting the benefit of the three best doctors at Camp Letterman consulting on your particular case. Now, we expect that kind of treatment today. You have a serious medical condition and you go to Johns Hopkins or you go to York. You're going to expect that level of treatment and analysis of your particular condition. That's what's happening to the patients at Camp Letterman. So let's take a look at some of them. And I want to note that we know a lot about these patients, not just because of those medical records I talked about, but also because of Henry Janes himself. He will keep a ledger book where he chronicles almost all, not all, but almost all of the patients that were treated at Letterman. He talks about their condition, their specific wound, how they did, their eventual outcome. And he creates this ledger book while he's at Letterman, but he would return to it, honestly, for the rest of his life, updating these patient conditions, figuring out what happened to these guys. Did they survive? How long was it till they fully recovered? Because I think even while he's at Letterman, Janes realizes that what is happening here can benefit medical knowledge. what he's learning at Letterman can be applied after the war in a variety of different avenues. And so he keeps that ledger book, and we know a lot about these patients. So let's look at a couple of them. And again, these are just a handful of the 4,217 men that at one point or another made their way through the camp. So Peter Brock. Peter Brock is an Irishman. He's in Company K of the 28th Massachusetts. He was a bootmaker from Milford, Massachusetts, which is a town not too far outside of Boston. He was an Irish immigrant. Came to the United States through New York in 1853. Again, as I mentioned, settles just outside of Boston. He was with the 28th Massachusetts in most of the battles and campaigns that regiment went through in the first 2 years of the American Civil War, including battles along the South Carolina coast. He's at the Battle of Antietam. He's at Fredericksburg. He's at Chancellorsville. On July 2nd, as the 28th Massachusetts and the rest of the Irish Brigade are moving through the wheat field, Peter Brock is wounded in the shoulder, severe wound. He's treated initially at the 2nd Corps Field Hospital. He's ultimately transferred to Camp Letterman. And we know about him in part because of Sophrina Buckland, that nurse that I mentioned a little bit earlier. And the picture she paints is not a pretty one. She would recall that this one fine-looking son of Erin's Isle, Peter Brock, was actually being neglected by the medical staff in his particular ward. He pleaded, he begged the surgeons to take a look at his shoulder. Eventually he succeeded, according to Buckland, through perseverance in obtaining an examination. But it just so happened that same day there was a photographer in Camp Letterman. And this poor man, Peter Brock, was brought out and essentially displayed in front of this photographer to have the image taken. And so what we have, and this is relatively rare, but what we have most likely is an actual procedure being done. That's Peter Brock. You can see the blood dripping down into the bucket, the medical team around him. Again, to her horror, Buckland recorded that this went on for about 3 hours. Quote, after mangling him there for a time, partly holding him under the influence of chloroform, they removed him to the amputating room, where they paused a while to have their photographs taken, the suffering patient lying in this critical condition. My blood, quote, boiled at the cruelty of the scene, but I could not avert the torture for a moment. Ultimately, according to Buckland, Brock survives the surgery, is placed under her care, and through her nursing, through her attention, she's able to raise him back to health. Peter Brock survives. He's transferred to a hospital in York for a while. He's then discharged from the Army in April of 1864. He goes back to bootmaking, and so he survives his Gettysburg wound. He marries, and I tracked him as far as the mid-1870s when his case kind of vanishes. But there you have, again, an actual patient being operated on at Camp Letterman, most likely Peter Brock. Another soldier, I think tragic would be the best word to describe it, tragic case, is a soldier from the 44th New York. He was 21 years old. His name was Richard Gawley. And during the fighting on Little Round Top, he suffered, quote, a compound comminuted fracture. The medical team in the back, am I saying that word right? Comminuted. And I had to look that up. Because a lot of the accounts, the medical records, there's what I would call a clinical detachment. And it takes a little while to parse out through this medical language what actually happened to this man. And so I researched that term, and what it means is a bone that's broken in 3 or more places. Right? So it's almost impossible to do anything with a wound like that other than, in cases where it's possible, amputation. So that's what this poor individual suffers. And then, according to the Jane's ledger, he's wounded by a mini ball, causing that fracture of the middle third of the right femur, the ball passing through the middle third of the thigh. And then we kind of chronicle his case over the next 2 months. August 8th, diarrhea and bed sores. Applying fermenting poultices to the bed sores with little good result. And that image of a bed sore, you wouldn't think a bed sore would be something really, really traumatic, but in the matter of fact, it is. And you can look at the medical and surgical history of the American Civil War, and bed sores and diarrhea are rife through these patient cases. And that's what this poor individual suffers. By August 18th, he's delirious, inflammation of the parotid gland. It's on the other each side of the neck, I believe. And ultimately, he continues sinking until he dies on the 20th of August. He's buried initially in the Letterman graveyard. He's exhumed and then reburied in the National Cemetery at Gettysburg. And as a final kind of tragic irony, his name is misspelled on the stone. So as you know, we're rehabilitating Little Round Top. We spent a lot of time on that area around the 44th New York. And I think of him every time we're up there. Another case. This is a man by the name of James T. Bedell. He's a cavalryman. He's in the 7th Michigan Cavalry. He's older than most soldiers in the Army of the Potomac. He's 43 years old. He's almost twice the age of the average soldier. He's engaged in the battle on East Cavalry Field. He's unhorsed, but he's not wounded. He's captured by Confederates, and it's while he's captured that a Confederate lieutenant strikes him in the head with his saber. They're moving these prisoners along, and apparently Bedell's not moving fast enough, and so he's struck in the head by this saber. According to the Jane's Ledger, quote, wounded on the left side of the cranium by a saber stroke, crushing the skull from a point 1 inch above the, I'm going to butcher this term, lambodial suture. Thank you, medical team in the back. But we can chronicle again this man's condition over the next, again, 2 months. At one point, he goes completely blind. At one point, the brain matter is actually protruding from the wound. He's completely conscious the entire time. He's able to speak. He knows what's happening to him. Finally, he ends up passing away on the 30th of August after, again, a severe chill and there's just enormous suffering. They autopsy him. And they actually remove the top of his skull. And you can see the fracture in the skull from where the saber blow hit him. Now, he's buried in the National Cemetery at Gettysburg. But what's not with him is his head, the top of his skull. That's sent to the Army Medical Museum, along with a host of other body parts that are taken from the wounded at Letterman. Now, the idea behind that is one of education. We're going to learn from what happened here. Daniel Sickles' leg, same deal, right? Ends up at the Army Medical Museum. The difference is Sickles knew about that. Did James Bedell know? Did he give consent? Did his family back in Michigan okay this? Probably not. And of course, as another bit of tragic irony, not irony, but another tragic element of the story, his mother is 83 years old, still alive. She depended entirely on him for her survival. And of course now he's buried, or what's left of him, in the National Cemetery at Gettysburg. In researching this, I tried to find unique cases, different kinds of wounds that these individuals suffered. One of the most remarkable was this gentleman, Sergeant Albert Dowdy, the 28th Virginia, that's Pickett's division. And on July 3rd, he's wounded, I presume during Pickett's charge, by a mini ball, which strikes him kind of here in the xiphoid process, I think is what they call it. And according to his record, this is what happens to him. He's wounded on July 3rd by the mini ball. Great shock was experienced at the time, and there was little hemorrhage. While defecating about 14 hours after the injury, he had a copious stool, and he heard something fall in the chamber pot, which examined was found to be the ball. He survives. He survives the wound. He's cured. He ends up as a prisoner of war, but he's still alive in the 1870s. Confederate Veteran, it's a magazine that's published after the war, chronicles this case. So he defecated out the mini ball that struck him. Another case is this gentleman, and like all of them, it's tragic. Private Thomas Breyer Ballou, he's 23 years old. He's in the 24th Michigan. He's wounded on the 1st of July. He's in the Iron Brigade. And he's wounded while the men of the 24th Michigan are actually retreating through town. The ball striking, quote, the right side of the hypergastrium, 1 inch to the right of the linea alba, and passing backward and downward, fracturing the right pubic bone and emerging 1 inch from the anus. A horrific, horrific wound. They removed several spicula, I believe, pieces of bone, and then also pieces of clothing and part of a button. Now, initially, it looked like this man was going to survive. He suffers a severe attack of gastroenteritis, which I believe is an infection, severe nausea, vomiting, but he ends up looking like he's improving. He improves enough that they transfer him out of Letterman to a hospital up in Harrisburg. And then his father from Michigan, Wayne County, I believe, actually travels out to Harrisburg to collect his son, who he believes is going to live. And it's only during the train ride back to Michigan, when they get to about Pittsburgh, that his son dies. And so rather than bringing home his recovered son, he brings home the body of his slain son, and he's buried today in a little cemetery not far from his hometown. Like any hospital, patients came and went. They recovered, they were sent back to their regiments or to general hospitals. If they're Confederates, ultimately they're sent to prisoner of war camps if they live. And if they don't, they're buried in the Letterman Cemetery. We have a recording, again, of almost every single day that hospital is in operation over those 121 days, over those 4 months. And the ledgers look a little bit like what I have up on the screen there. It records how many wounded of Union and Confederate soldiers are there, how many attendants, how many die each day. And it's an amazing chronicle for us to look at and track the progress of the aftermath of the battle, at least as it occurred to Letterman, or at Letterman. And what we see over the days, the weeks, the months, is that the number of patients at Letterman starts to shrink. The number of medical staff dwindle, they contract, until by late November, the hospital is essentially at a place where it can close. And by a kind of strange coincidence, the hospital closes on November 20th, the day following the consecration of the Soldiers' National Cemetery and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So one of the final things a lot of these nurses and doctors get to do is go to the cemetery and see Abraham Lincoln and hear him deliver that consecration speech. There's still a lot we don't know, and I hate to be too specific about numbers, but just in brief, some takeaways from Letterman. It's an operation for 121 days. Approximately 4,217 wounded soldiers make their way through Letterman at one time or another. And of those, and I want to, again, a bit of a caveat to this because it's imprecise, around, I believe, 300 to 350 burials in the Letterman graveyard. And if you look at all of that and put it all together, you get an estimated mortality rate of about 6%, which is actually pretty darn good. Pretty darn good when you think that only the worst cases end up at that hospital. But ultimately, as I mentioned, the camp closes. And for a lot of the individuals who worked there, Sophronia Buckland, Henry Janes, I'd have to imagine, there's a bittersweet element to that. Sophronia Buckland would write of the camp closing, quote, "The hospital tents were removed. Each bare and dust-trampled space marking where corpses had lain after their death agony was past and where the wounded had groaned in pain. Tears filled my eyes when I looked on that great field, so checkered with ditches that had drained it dry. So many of them," not talking about the wounded, "so many of them I had seen depart to the silent land, so many I had learned to respect." Sophronia Buckland would remain a nurse for the remainder of the American Civil War. She's there during the Overland Campaign. As I mentioned, she writes one of the best accounts of daily life in Camp Letterman that we have. It's available for free online. She never marries. She dies in 1902, and she's buried in Lakeview Cemetery in New York. By a kind of, I don't know if this is a trivial matter, but also buried in that cemetery is Carl Sagan, the astronomer of the cosmos fame. And you would think that these two people have nothing to do with one another. But Carl Sagan is here on the battlefield for the rededication of the Eternal Light Peace Memorial for the 125th anniversary of the battle. And he gives a speech talking about the inhumanity of human beings to kill one another. And to me, that's kind of in line with Buckland's desire to take care of individuals who are maimed during the American Civil War. Cornelia Hancock, she's only at the hospital through mid-September. But like Buckland, she'll dedicate the rest of her life to the care of the wounded, of the poor. She serves with the Army of the Potomac during the Wilderness Campaign. She's at City Point, Virginia. Following the American Civil War, she cares for the poor and the sick in places like Philadelphia, New York, even as far away as London. She was referred to by one of her patients as the Florence Nightingale of the United States. She never marries. She dies in 1927 at the age of 87, but she returns to Gettysburg one last time. That's her in 1913 for the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg and the Great Peace Jubilee. Her book, her letters rather, are published posthumously. It's one of the classic accounts of nursing during the American Civil War. It is still in print, and so I encourage you, if you've not read that, it's a good one. It's a good one to read. Cyrus Chamberlain, not the embalmer, the doctor. Serves the rest of the war, returned to Massachusetts, settled in Lawrence, which is kind of on the northeast corner of the state. Practiced medicine for the rest of his life. He becomes a pension examiner. So if you were a wounded soldier, filed for a pension, this is one of the guys examining your case, part of that bureaucratic system that is established following the war. He dies in 1899 at the age of 70. He's buried up in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And again, one of the unsung heroes of the Battle of Gettysburg. Jonathan Letterman. I don't believe Jonathan Letterman ever stepped foot in Camp Letterman. Never saw it, even though it's arguably one of his greatest legacies, at least on the Gettysburg battlefield. He never lost interest in Jane's and the care of the wounded there, though. And through the next couple of months, he would write frequently back to Jane's, inquiring after the status of the camp and the patients being treated there. Ultimately, he's a victim of kind of the political system that existed at the time that didn't care for individuals who were trying to establish the status quo. And that's certainly what Jonathan Letterman did. He resigns from the Army in 1864, ends up with his wife relocating to San Francisco. His wife dies. He spirals into a state of depression, and he himself dies in 1872, largely forgotten by history. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Letterman's greatest legacy, though, is the system that he developed that is, by and large, still being used in the United States military today. There's a quote from a man by the name of Paul Hawley, who was responsible for the medical care during the Normandy invasion in World War II. And Hawley would later say that he prayed and thanked God for Jonathan Letterman every single day, because Letterman's system was still being used to save lives on the battlefield in the 1940s. And what happens to Henry Janes? Janes is among the last to leave the Gettysburg area. And maybe in a certain sense, the battle doesn't truly end until his departure. He serves as a doctor in the United States Army for the rest of the American Civil War for a brief period of time. He's serving on a hospital steamer. And then he takes over the administration of, quote, the Sloan General Hospital, which is in Montpelier, Vermont. He dedicates the rest of his life to studying medicine, becomes one of the leading physicians in not just Vermont, but in New England. For a brief period of time, he's actually teaching medicine at the University of Vermont. He would write journal articles. He would present at conferences. He would give papers regarding his medical findings during the American Civil War, his battlefield experience, that he hoped others would learn from, in the goal being to help save lives. In 1903, he publishes a paper of a very different kind. And the paper is, quote, called, "Why is the profession of killing more generally honored than that of saving lives?" And this is at a point in time when I think Janes is, I won't call him bitter, but frustrated by the fact that the men and women, like himself, that are struggling to care for the wounded men following conflicts like the American Civil War seem to be forgotten, while the generals, the officers, well, they get bronze statues, they get battlefield parks. He writes in that paper that, quote, "The Army surgeon sees little glory in war. Does not the surgeon serve his country as effectively and honorably and humanity vastly more by preserving the lives of its citizens than the line officer does by inciting the men under him to maim and kill its enemies?" He dies in 1915. In his will, he actually donates his home. Let me go back. That's his home. He donates his home to the city of Waterbury. on the condition that it be a library for the people that live there. 100 and almost 10 years later, that's still the library in Waterbury, Connecticut. And they have one corner of that building as a office space or as a kind of museum to Janes. And you can go in there and he has his little Dr. Jane sign, and he's got a picture of Abraham Lincoln. And in one corner of the office, he has Batchelder's isometric map. And when I saw that, I wondered to myself, how many times did Janes, as an older man, go up to that map and find the right-hand corner where that hospital was depicted on that map? And how often did he think about his time there and the wounded men that he treated there? And I'm sure he must have done that. He would, I think, ultimately be sad, but perhaps, I think he would ultimately be sad by the state of the camp today. Letterman, the site of Letterman, you've probably passed it 1,000 times. It's on the right-hand side of US 30, the York Pike, as you leave Gettysburg. It's a shopping plaza now. There's a gas station there. There's an Arby's. There's a grocery store there. And so it's largely gone. It's largely gone. But throughout the past 160 years, time and again, people had tried, almost always in vain, to save that site. The newspaper clippings you see up on the screen there, they're from the 19-teens. And this is locals who lived here, and also Army veterans saying that site, the hospital in the woods, is important enough to save. Why is not the federal government buying that land? And they're ultimately rebuffed. John Page Nicholson, who's the chairman of the Gettysburg National Park Commission, in response to a congressional inquiry, would say, quote, "No appropriation was made to purchase the land, and the price for the hospital woods is entirely too high, considering the number of acres. The real hospital woods north of the pike to the railroad was cut down years ago, and the present woods have no sentiment whatever." And reading that, I think he might even be confused as to where the hospital is. But they do, the War Department, they do, at the very least, place a small marker to denote the site of the camp that's still there today. In the 1990s, prior to the construction of the shopping plaza, there's an archaeological survey of the camp. And I didn't think that they would have found anything. But in my research, I came across this newspaper article where the senior archaeologists in the project, they're doing compliance archaeology before the shopping center is built. He writes that, quote, "The crew unearthed shrapnel, officers' buttons, canister fragments, cut nails, a pipe stem, bottle glass, stoneware inkwell fragments, and this I found most remarkable, post-hole stains denoting the presence of tent poles." I was still on the site. You could still find that archaeologically up until the 1990s. And here's a National Park Service map of the site as it exists today, overlaid with the modern development on the hill. So why does any of this matter? Why should we care about Camp Letterman or Peter Brock or Cornelia Hancock or Henry James beyond just as a historical curiosity? And we're all interested in history. We're all fascinated by the past, but we are not most people. We are not most Americans. So as a society, why should we care about all this? And any conversation like this tends to get a little preachy, and so I'm going to try to avoid doing that. But I can think of a couple reasons why we should care about Camp Letterman. First, we are a society that send men and women into combat. And any nation that does that should have a clear understanding of what that means, what that truly entails, holistically. And I think it's really incumbent on places like Gettysburg and Antietam and Shiloh and these battlefield parks to make sure that the story we tell doesn't stop when the last bullet is fired, that we continue that story. And I think what we'll find is that sometimes the men who are killed outright, they're the fortunate ones. And it's those others that suffer for the next week, month, or even years that we should remember when we talk about these things. And Camp Letterman can perhaps be a reminder of that. Secondly, all of us, I would have to imagine, at some point in our lives, will be hospitalized. Some of us, no doubt, have already had that experience, or we've been to an emergency room. And when we go, we have expectations. We expect that the hospital will be staffed with trained medical professionals, that the equipment and medicine we need will be on hand, that we have medical records that they can pull up that will inform them about our particular case or our treatment, that if we need to be transported to another hospital or to another specialist, that there are processes in place that will make that possible. We expect all those things today. Those expectations did not exist prior to the American Civil War. And none of these things are invented at Camp Letterman. But the story of Letterman, those 4 months, they're a waymarker on that journey from no expectations in terms of medicine to quite a lot today. So Letterman reminds us of that. And then finally, I think Letterman has something to say about preservation, about how we understand the past, or at least how the general public understands the past. I think as a society, we save what we value, but then we value what we've saved. And we're very good as a nation at preserving battlefield land. We're pretty good at that. We're very good at preserving the homes of rich and influential people. We're not so good at a lot of other things. And we can't save everything. We cannot save everything, and we shouldn't save everything. Communities need places to live. People need places to shop and to go to school. Gettysburg is a tourist town. People need restaurants. People need hotels. We need all of those things. But one can't help wonder what the experience of visiting Gettysburg would be like. How different it would be if your tour didn't end at the cemetery, but it ended at the hospital in the woods off of Route 30. And so in conclusion, I'll just ask you this. Perhaps the next time you go grocery shopping, or perhaps the next time you pick up your pizza or fill your gas tank, or visit your favorite fast food place, you'll take a moment and do Dr. Janes proud by remembering those 121 days following the Battle of Gettysburg. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you all. The camp is named in honor of Jonathan Letterman, but the actual surgeon, the doctor managing the camp, administrating it, is Henry Janes. And if Letterman is one of the forgotten figures in history, Janes is even more so. But I think it's a testament to the esteem that Janes had for Letterman and the innovations that Letterman introduced to the Army of the Potomac that Janes then was able to execute that prompted them to name the camp after Jonathan Letterman. But Janes is the guy that's the boots on the ground. He's the one managing the hospital. He's the one dealing with the most critical patients. It's Henry Janes. And so really, he's a fascinating individual. We should talk more about him. He's really one of the unsung heroes of the Battle of Gettysburg.
Cool.